At dinner my son clinked his glass and called my late wife our household ghost. Everyone laughed, until I slid a folded paper onto his plate. The room went quiet when he read the first line, "Notice to pay or quit." It was signed by the new owner. I had already bought their landlord. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. I am 71 years old. My name is Walter Briggs, Walt to everyone who ever earned the right. I have 2 titanium hips, a scar on my left forearm from a saw that bucked wrong in 1981, and a house that still smells faintly like the lemon oil my wife, Ruth, used on the banister every Sunday afternoon. She has been gone 2 years, 3 months, and 9 days, and that is not a number I have to count. It is the tally my bones keep without asking. Grief did not make me foolish. Love did not make me blind. But family has a way of convincing you that weakness is the price of belonging. I paid it for longer than I will admit, especially when it came to my son, Peter, and his wife, Sloane. Our grandchildren, Ellie and Max, are the reason I woke up in those first months after Ruth died. Her last words to me, spoken with lips the color of winter peaches, were simple enough to sound ordinary: take care of them. By them, she meant all of us, but I saw her eyes flick toward the framed picture on the dresser with Ellie in a cowboy hat and Max missing both front teeth. Take care of them. So I did, and I kept on doing it long after it stopped looking like care and started looking like repair. Every month after Ruth's funeral I sent money to Peter for the kids' things. It had a way of shrinking the world to something small enough to carry: a field trip paid, braces tightened, the camp that smelled like lake water and pine. $2,000. Automatic. He always said thank you. Sometimes Sloane would add a heart emoji. Sometimes not. Then a new house happened, a rental with soaring ceilings and a kitchen that photographed well. The kids changed schools. The thank yous got shorter. The night everything snapped, I was sitting at their long reclaimed wood dining table, the one Sloane said had character, which I learned was code for splinters. It was a Friday. Ellie had an orchestra concert in a black dress that made her look older than 13, and Max had a science experiment drying near the back door that promised to explode if anyone breathed near it. I had brought a lemon cake Ruth used to make from a recipe card still smudged with her finger, and Sloane had bought sushi and arranged it like a catalog image. We ate. We traded the expected updates. Then wine happened, one glass, then another, and Sloane told a story about a neighbor who still wore shoulder pads. Honestly, she said, head tilted just so, it is like watching the 80s haunt the cul-de-sac. My son laughed. Just like Mom's roast, he said, and lifted his glass. God save us from the nutmeg. Sloane slouched with the ease of someone who believed she could not be corrected. Or that terrible habit of blessing people when they sneezed. So performative. It kept going. The way she folded towels, the floral perfumes Ruth liked because they were cheap and bright as summer, that saintly sigh Ruth made when she was tired and still kept going anyway. They impersonated my wife at her own table, and the people she gave her life to laughed into their wineglasses. I did not say a word. I watched my son's hand mimic Ruth's old, theatrical flick of flour from her wrist like it was a joke worth telling, and I redecorated the room with quiet. The kitchen lights buzzed at the edges of hearing. A neighbor's dog barked 2 streets over. Ellie stared at her plate like she had discovered the real point of geometry. Max picked at the blister of glue on his science experiment until it peeled off in one perfect fish scale. Dad? Peter said, noticing at last that I had not laughed. We were just teasing. Mom had a sense of humor. She did, I said. She also had a history of listening before she spoke. Sloane rolled her eyes like that was quaint. I let it pass. The kids cleared plates while the adults pretended to be interesting. When Max slipped back into the dining room for his jacket, too thin for the weather, but he liked the baseball patches Ruth had sewn inside it, I reached for my cane the way a man reaches for something to lean his whole heart on. "Max," I said, barely above a whisper. He looked over his shoulder like the house might punish him for whispering back. "How is school?" He shrugged in a language that 12-year-old boys speak fluently. Then he leaned in, elbows on his knees, and the smell of peppermint gum and clean hair hit me like the memory of bedtime at our old house. "Grandpa," he said from out of the safe tunnel of his cupped hands, "Mom says we are not supposed to talk about Grandma." "But we do. We do anyway." "We?" I asked. "Me and Ellie," he said. "We do at night. We say what we remember so we do not forget." A minute later Ellie was there too, called by a sense older than her mother's lavender candles. She folded herself into the chair beside me like an origami crane and said, "Mom says Grandma was dramatic. She says you two were old-fashioned and that she is helping us be modern. But she did not come to Grandma's last hospital day. She said she cannot with hospitals. That is modern too, I guess. She said modern like it meant expensive shoes." "We remember," Ellie added, softer. "Do you?" "I remember everything," I said. The words were a pain pill I did not know I needed. And I am very tired of pretending that I do not. Max glanced at the kitchen where his parents were laughing with the latest people their new neighborhood required, then back at me like he could not believe he was daring his next sentence to live. "Grandpa, Mom reads the letters you put in my camp bag before she lets me. She takes them out. She says she edits for length." Heat rose in my face in a way that made me feel younger than I had any right to feel, and not in a nice way. It felt like the first time a foreman patted my shoulder and told me good job, then padded his invoice with my hours. It felt like being used and told it was love. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." They stayed there a moment longer, two small conspirators with their righteous faces and a courage I recognized from the mirror on my wedding day. Then they were gone, pulled back into the choreography of plates and dishwashers and everything in a modern kitchen that had a handle but no soul. By the time I got home my plan had a skeleton. By morning it had muscles. By Sunday, it had a pulse. I started where any old man with a pencil and a lifetime of paying attention starts, with the numbers. 42 years a contractor taught me that people lie, emotions lie, even the mirror lies. Ledgers do not. 2 years of transfers to Peter's account. 2 years of receipts he had texted me after the fact, like proof was polite. 2 years of Sloane's social media that seemed to believe money grew on ring lights. The kids' school changed the month they moved into the rental with the vaulted ceilings and the suspiciously new, original, beams. Tuition jumped. They said there were more opportunities. Ellie's violin teacher did not change because her teacher was worth changing for. The kids' dentist did change, twice. The kids' things' ledger glowed with an unmistakable pattern. My money for them had become a solvent that dissolved the edges of their parents' wants. Everything large happened just after my deposit hit. A weekend away in Scottsdale. A new, starter, dining set that looked exactly like the old dining set except for the brand name. A fling with a subscription box that sent shampoo in bottles heavy enough to double as doorstops. And the house. A rental in a neighborhood that had a name stitched into the front gate in wrought iron, like a belt buckle across a too-tight stomach. They had not bought it. They could not. But they had signed a lease with a landlord who needed the predictability of tenants who never quite learned what affordability was. It is a funny thing about being old and not dead yet. I have friends. They have friends. A former client called another former client. An attorney returned my message on a Sunday. A property manager owed me a favor from the winter I loaned him my backup generator when the power went and the pipes would have gone right after. I learned the name of the holding company that owned the house on Meadowlark Circle. I learned the renewal date. I learned the owner was a widower who had moved to Florida and liked cash more than headaches. On Wednesday I met him at a coffee shop with a carpet that smelled like last year's rain. I brought a manila folder and a check in the face Ruth called my courthouse face, the one I used when inspectors tried to tell me a handrail height was up to their creativity. I am not a flipper, I told the widower. I do not want to raise the rent. I want the house. I could have said more but decided to save my breath for my grandchildren. He wanted to know why. I told him the truth. He nodded like a man who had lived enough days to recognize the shape of one worth believing. We signed. The ink dried like a small weather system of relief across my chest. By Friday, the deed sat in my desk next to Ruth's recipe cards. I slid the papers into a folder I labeled with a black marker I had been saving since before the kids were born, Meadowlark. I did not turn off the money right away. You cannot spring a trap before it is set. I am not cruel, I am thorough. I called my bank and changed the destination of those automatic transfers to a new account with a name that made my throat ache for a while and then feel better, the Ruth Briggs Legacy Fund. I seeded it with a sum large enough that the woman on the phone asked me twice to confirm. I had done well in my life. Not flashy. Not dumb. Well enough. Then I visited the kids' school and spoke to the principal. I said I wanted to establish something modest but stubborn, a trust for Ellie and Max that would pay directly for their schooling, their music, their science, their clubs, nothing fancy, everything necessary. The trust would hold one clause like a steel spine, any request must be tied to the children's benefit. A soccer camp is yes. A resort with a lazy river is no. New violin strings, yes. A ladies' trip to Napa in the name of self-care, no. I smiled when I said no. The principal smiled back with a kind of relief I recognized. He had seen my children. He had also seen my son. Every move I made came with the memory of Ruth at the kitchen table, her hand resting on my forearm as I wrote checks or built budgets or counted the coins it sometimes came down to when our first house barely had walls. She had a way of making the act of providing feel like art. The night before her last hospital admission, she told me she had been afraid our grandchildren would grow up thinking money just appeared. Give them the gift of understanding where it comes from, she said, and watch what they do with it. I had not understood how to give that gift while she was alive. I understood now. 2 days after I bought the house on Meadowlark Circle, I invited my family to dinner. My house. My table. My rules. I pulled down the copper pot Ruth had loved and polished it until the number etched onto its bottom looked like a small, round sun. I made the roast with nutmeg, the one they said was too much and ate anyway every time Ruth made it. I put out the apron she sewed for Ellie and me when Ellie was 5 and insisted on dumping whole bags of flour on the counter to feel what snow might be like. At 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened the door on my courthouse face softened by the memory of Peter at 7, collar crooked, ears too big for his head, a boy who cried into my shirt once because he had broken the handle on Ruth's favorite mug and told me to never tell her. I did not. Some secrets you keep because keeping them is an act of love. Sloane came in first, perfume like citrus and apology. Peter followed, eyes scanning the room for cues. Ellie and Max stepped in and the whole house lifted a fraction to meet them, as if the floor knew that raw material was remarkably close to becoming someone magnificent. We ate. We talked about things that did not matter at all, traffic and sports and the price of eggs, while the only thing that mattered circled the table like a hawk. A hawk eventually decides. I waited until Sloane lifted her second glass. Then I said, "Let us raise a toast." Peter smirked because somewhere along the way he had taught himself that any ceremonial sentence that starts with those words is ridiculous. "To Ruth," I said. To her terrible habit of blessing sneezers, to her dramatic apron strings, to her roast that used too much nutmeg, to the woman whose hands kept your lights on and your son breathing when his croup was bad and your career unbroken when your first boss was reckless and you came home shaking. To the woman who ironed your prom shirt at midnight because you forgot to tell her you needed it, and then told me not to scold you because you were a good boy who would remember next time. To her, and to the idea that if you cannot keep her name in your mouth with love, you do not deserve to speak it at all. The words did not explode. They settled. That can be worse. Peter's mouth opened and closed. Sloane's laugh was a bird that hit a window and slid down onto the sill, stunned. Ellie sat straighter. Max looked at his hands like he had not known until that second that they were good for making fists. "We were joking," Sloane said finally. "Jokes are relief for truth," I said. "So let us tell the truth." I pulled the folder from the chair beside me and placed it on the tablecloth Ruth had stitched by hand. The papers made the sound thin paper always makes when it wants to be heavier than it is. "What is that?" Peter asked, which gave me exactly the opening I required. "This," I said, "is meadowlark." I watched them register that as a word they knew in a context they did not. Then I watched comprehension dawn like a bad sunrise. "The landlord sold the property," I said, quiet enough that I did not have to lower my voice to sound calm. "I bought it." Silence is supposed to be golden. Sometimes it is nickel, the cheap kind that turns your finger green when you pretend to wear a ring you cannot afford. "You what?" Sloane said, pitch clicking up a notch like she had turned into someone who bites nails. "I bought your house," I said, and unfolded the notice. Peter looked at the first line and made the small sound men make when their version of the world changes without their permission. Then he did what he does when the ground moves, he looked for someone to blame. "You cannot." "I can," I said. I did. "The rent will not change." "The terms will." "Terms?" Sloane repeated like I had introduced a foreign currency. I reached into the folder again and slid a second document across the table, this one printed on thicker paper because I wanted it to feel like the backbone it was. "This is the Ruth Briggs Legacy Fund," I said. "It will pay for the children's school and music and health. It will not pay for your purses or your kitchens or your weekends. The automatic transfers to your account have been redirected. You will not get another dollar from me for anything that does not touch those two heads directly." "Dad," Peter said. It could have been a question. It could have been an accusation. It turned out to be both. "Peter," I said. "Do not forget that when you ask me for money, you asked the man who worked through 2 torn rotator cuffs so you would not know what it feels like to be hungry." His expression slid. For a second, I saw the boy who cried about the mug. Sloane tried a different approach. This is controlling." "No," I said, and felt the old anger settle into something useful. "This is stewardship." I poured myself water and let the glass sweat onto the cloth. It felt like an honest body doing an honest job. "You will also do some toasting," I continued, and glanced at Ellie and Max to anchor my next words to something pure. You will raise your glasses once a month in my house at Legacy Night, and you will say one true thing you remember about the woman who made your lives possible. If you want the rent to stay as it is, if you want the children's school paid directly, if you want the grace you have taken for granted to keep its shape, then you will honor the person who built the foundation under your feet. Sloane laughed a laugh that she must have thought would sound powerful. It sounded like a fork dropped in the wrong place. You cannot force us to praise a dead woman. Watch me, I said, and then softened it because I could. You will not be forced. You will be invited. If you decline, that is your right. The lease will not renew. Your landlord is older and believes very firmly in respect. You said you would not raise the rent, Peter snapped, not noticing that I had already given him a reason to thank me for restraint and instead choosing the old family ritual of choosing a single tree to ignore the fact that the forest is on fire. I said the rent would not change, I said. I also said the terms would. Respect is the first term. The second is this: the money I am willing to pour into your family will have one direction, your children. Consider this my new job description: grandfather, not silent partner. Ellie's eyes shone in a way I will carry into whatever quiet eternity looks like. Max whispered, "Holy smokes," and then went red because he realized he had said holy in front of his grandfather, as if I was the Vatican. Sloane stood, sat, and stood again, like performing her uncertainty would convert it into power. You have no right, she said. I looked at my son so that if any gospel could be preached that night, it would be the gospel of an old man telling the truth to his boy. I have every right, Peter, but that is not the point. The point is that the person you called a ghost was a woman who loved you as if that love could change physics. She made you dinner when you were 26 and ashamed because your boss caught your mistake and you thought you had ruined your life. She sat with you in the bathtub at 5 in the morning when you had gotten sick from rotavirus and thought you would die. She papered your high school locker with notes that said nothing except, "I believe in you." And I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it: I will not let you teach my grandchildren that love is something to mock when it becomes inconvenient. What does this have to do with money? Sloane said, which was the closest thing to a confession she had ever uttered. Everything, I said, and took a bite of the roast to show that dinner was still happening no matter what we discovered we had to swallow. Because the way you spend is the way you tell a story about what matters. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Her face rearranged itself into smaller versions of itself and then paused like it was waiting for orders. We, Peter and I, we have a life. It is not fair for you to take what you promised and reroute it like a plumbing mistake. Fair, I said, and the word fell heavy enough to dent the tablecloth. Fair is Ruth dying before you could learn how to love her right. This is not about fair. This is about direction. For the sake of the children, I kept my voice even. For the sake of my wife, I kept my spine straight. There are nights you do not forget because they carry a hinge on which the door of your life swings. This was one. I knew it as surely as I knew the best way to coax a stripped screw out of stubborn wood. Peter did not cry. I could not have asked for anything so uncivilized as that. But his jaw loosened. I watched him remember that he once had a mother who was better at grace than anyone he had met since. What do we have to do? He asked, and he used we to reach for his wife even as he felt the impossibility of holding hands tightly with someone who insisted on holding herself first. Live smaller, I said. Speak kinder. Spend where your children's names would not be out of place on the receipt. That is not how credit card statements work, Sloane said, aiming for clever and landing on brittle. It is tonight, I said. I had more pages. I did not need them all. I had called the city to ask about zoning and the consequences of a landlord non-renewing a lease for cause. I had asked an attorney, gently, carefully, without letting him jump to conclusions, about what financial support promised without contract looks like in court. I had set up automatic payments directly to the orthodontist, the school, the violin shop. I had done the homework my son should have done before the test. Then I did something else that could look like cruelty if you squinted at it while standing too far away. I started the delicate reverse mocking. The next morning I texted Sloane a photograph of a recipe card in Ruth's handwriting, the roast with the nutmeg, and wrote, "I put less nutmeg this time. Current culinary trends." Then I sent another photo, this one of the apron Ruth had stitched for Sloane as a peace offering during the first winter of their marriage when Sloane was so hungry to prove she belonged that she burned a grilled cheese and cried. The apron had Sloane's name on it in thread the color of daffodils. I wrote, "Fashion-forward archive piece. Recommend wearing at next family night." Sloane did not respond. I did not expect her to. I started releasing Ruth's phrases back into the air in updated packaging. When someone sneezed, I did not say bless you. I said, "We acknowledge your lungs' performance." When Ellie found $1 in the couch cushions, I did not say, "Put it in the jar for camp." I said, "Consider this targeted funding." When Peter left his coat on the chair, I said, "Your jacket has misinterpreted the concept of a hook." It was not cruel. It was gentle. It showed them how silly disrespect sounds when it thinks it is sophistication. It reminded them what love sounds like when it is not embarrassed to tell the truth and then do the dishes. At the first legacy night, we set 3 place settings and a 4th for the person who would always find her way to them. I cooked. Ellie made a playlist of songs Ruth loved, and Max brought the science experiment that had been threatening to explode and showed us how, if you added 1 drop instead of 2, the foam behaved. I was grateful to the foam for behaving. When we raised our glasses, Sloane did not speak first. I did not ask her to. Peter did. "To Mom," he said. "For showing me how to listen." He swallowed like the act of moving something down his throat would turn into an act of moving something difficult out of his life. Ellie said, "To Grandma, for teaching me to name colors beyond red and blue. For marigold and ultramarine and oyster." Max said, "To Grandma, for not telling me to stop drumming on things until the timer was up." Then he looked at his mother for permission to have said something true and flinched when he realized he had not needed to ask. Sloane stared at her glass the way you stare at an X-ray that teaches you the map of your own bones. "To Ruth," she said at last, and saying the name cost her. For, she stopped, and the silence felt like the first honest thing she had brought to my table. For making a son who stayed. We did not clap. We did not need to. We ate lemon cake, the recipe card between us like a treaty. We passed plates and salt and a bowl of peas that Max did not want but negotiated a 2-bite piece with. I watched a family choose again, which is the only choice that counts. There were consequences after that night, because people are not light switches and redemption is not electricity. The next day, Sloane posted a photo of a handbag she had been saving for, and within an hour it was deleted. I did not ask, but I suspect Ellie told her mother what it feels like to unbox something with a price tag bigger than a memory. Peter tried to argue with the orthodontist about whether a new bracket color was covered by the trust. The orthodontist's receptionist, a woman who had seen enough families to skip introductions, said, "Mr. Briggs, the grandfather pays directly now. We have his instructions." He did not like that. But he liked the way his son's overbite began to resolve. I did not raise the rent. I did not have to. The third legacy night, I slid an envelope across the table. Inside were 4 laminated cards like the emergency contacts schools used to require. I had titled them simply, The Covenant. It was not religious, though if you want to see faith in action, watch an old man offer his last good years to his grandchildren and then stand back so they can run. The covenant said 4 things. First, you will not mock Ruth. If you are tempted, you will imagine her in this room, which is not difficult, and you will try again. Second, you will allocate your monthly discretionary spending after you allocate your children's needs. If you cannot tell the difference, you will ask Ellie. She knows. Third, you will attend legacy night unless you are in the hospital or required by a judge to be elsewhere. If you cannot make it, you will send a memory, not an excuse. Fourth, if any of this feels like punishment, you will remember that it is permission, to be the kind of parents who raise the kind of people Ruth believed you could be. The reverse mocking reached its gentle peak on a Sunday afternoon when Sloane came over early and hovered in the doorway of the kitchen like she might get burned by entry. She wore the apron. The daffodil thread glowed like the first sun through late winter. I do not know how to make the lemon cake, she said without looking at me. Will you show me? I took the card out and set it on the counter where the light loved it best. The nutmeg goes here, I said, tapping where Ruth had underlined a note about how much is too much and what happens if you are married to a man who never says too much when it comes to the things that matter. We worked. We made a mess. The dog next door barked. Max asked if he could lick the beaters and then remembered that modern parenting hates licking anything remotely fun. I said, your mother will decide, and for the first time in a long time, she decided like someone who remembered joy. The trap, the financial one, finished tightening itself that month. The landlord I had purchased the house from sent the renewal paperwork on my letterhead. The lease now included a clause about non-renewal in case of disrespect toward family members at the owner's discretion. I did not want to invoke it. I wanted it to exist the way a handrail exists, not to punish falling, but to keep it from happening. Peter came over 2 days later with a face that told me we had finally arrived at the part of the road where a man has to get out and walk. He had papers. He had a summary of expenses. He had a question, how do I do this? We sat at the kitchen table where I had taught him fractions with M&Ms and made him use pretzels for subtraction when he ate his answers. We wrote a budget like it was a prayer. First names at the top, Ellie. Max. Then columns. Then a line item titled Sloane's handbag recovery, and I will admit I enjoyed that. He smiled despite himself and said, she is trying. I said, so are you. He got a second job. It was humble and honest, and for the first time in years his back hurt at night in the way that tells you did something worth being sore about. He came to legacy night sweaty and happy. He brought beer once and put it down when he realized it tasted like pretending to be someone else. He hugged me in the hallway as he left and did not say anything worth writing down. He did not have to. Sloane started keeping a notebook. She wrote the kids' needs at the top and her wants at the bottom. The bottom got small. The top got colorful. She came with us to the cemetery on a Wednesday afternoon when Ellie had a half day and placed a single marigold in the vase because Ellie said marigold like it was a name for bravery. She cried, the quiet kind that belongs to people who spent too long hoping no one noticed their tears. At the end of summer, we had a party in the backyard. We set a table big enough to tempt bad weather and watched the sky decide to be good. The kids ran through the lawn with sparklers we pretended were legal. The neighbors came. We played the songs Ruth loved. When the first piece of cake went to Max and the second to Ellie and the third to Sloane and the fourth to Peter and the fifth to me, I thought of how revenge is the wrong word for what we had done. This was not revenge. It was restoration. But sweet? Yes. Sweet as lemon and sugar under a fork. I keep the folder labeled Meadowlark in my desk. I do not need it the way I did. Now and again I slide it out and remind myself what strength looks like when it is written in ink. I also keep a copy of the covenant on the fridge where the grocery list lives, right next to a photograph of Ruth in the dress she wore the day we closed on our first house. Her hair is big in a way that would embarrass Sloane if she still believed embarrassment belonged to anyone but the person who uses it to avoid feeling what is true. There are nights when I take out the recipe cards and run my thumb over the indent of her pen. There are mornings when Ellie texts me a photo of the sunrise because she remembers that Ruth believed sunrises were proof we get to start over. There are afternoons when Max calls to tell me he got a perfect score on a science quiz and whispers, "We do not tell Mom everything yet," and I say, "Trust grows," and we practice together. Once, when the house on Meadowlark smelled like cinnamon and new pencils, Sloane stopped at the driveway when she saw me getting out of my truck. She looked tired and very alive. She said, "I was selfish." I said, "You were hurt." She nodded and said, "Both." Then, quietly, "Thank you for making it cost something." We stood there with the trash cans and the hydrangeas and the sky doing that late afternoon thing Ruth used to call lavender, and I forgave her, not because she asked, but because my grandchildren needed me to know how. They never again said my wife's name like it was a prop. They never again used my money like it was water in someone else's drought. They signed their lease renewal with a respect clause and framed the covenant in their hallway as if it were art. They spend everything that is not gas and groceries on their children because otherwise they will be stripped of everything else, and they know it. Once a month we gather for Legacy Night. We eat too much and drink water because I do not trust wine where grief lives. We tell a story about Ruth. Some stories are bright, some are smaller and live in the corners. Some make us weep in a way that would have embarrassed us once and now feels like washing. And if ever someone sneezes, if ever the room goes quiet and waits to see what we will do with that small moment that holds the whole of how we live, someone says what Ruth would have said. We bless it. And then we keep going.
Greetings, and thanks for spending your time with us today. I truly hope you enjoyed the video. I want to wish you a peaceful day or a restful evening, wherever you may be. Take care, and we'll see you next time.